In 1855, the Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce commissioned a comprehensive classification system to organize the region's wine estates according to quality and establish transparent market hierarchies. The system was designed as a rational solution to market chaos, too many producers, inconsistent pricing, and buyer confusion about relative quality standards. The Classification Committee, composed of wine merchants and brokers who possessed decades of market experience, approached the task with systematic methodology. They examined historical sales data, analyzed price trends across multiple vintages, and consulted established trade relationships to create what they believed would be an objective quality ranking. The foundational premise appeared logical: price, over time, accurately reflects quality. If Château Margaux consistently commanded higher prices than Château Palmer across multiple vintages and market conditions, this differential must indicate superior intrinsic quality. The Classification Committee assumed that market forces operating over sufficient time periods would naturally sort estates according to their objective winemaking capabilities. Price became both the measurement tool and the validation mechanism. Estates that consistently achieved premium pricing demonstrated superior terroir, winemaking technique, or production standards that justified their market position. This price-based evaluation methodology embedded a critical assumption into the system's architecture: market pricing represents neutral quality assessment rather than manipulable competitive positioning. The committee treated historical price data as scientific measurement, equivalent to soil analysis or climatological records. They believed they were documenting existing quality relationships rather than creating institutional frameworks that would shape future market dynamics. The classification was intended to provide market clarity by codifying what already existed, not to establish mechanisms that would drive market concentration towards specific estates. The system's designers expected diversified competition to emerge naturally from their transparent rankings. First growth estates would compete against each other for premium positioning. Second and third growth estates would develop distinct market segments based on their classified standings. The classification would provide clear consumer guidance while maintaining competitive balance across multiple tiers. Market forces would continue operating within these established categories, with individual estates rising or falling based on performance relative to their classified peers. However, the classification methodology contained a fundamental design flaw that its creators could not perceive from within their market context. By using price as the primary quality indicator, the system created circular logic where market position determined classification rank and classification rank determined market position. The committee assumed that price reflected underlying quality characteristics, but failed to recognize that price also shapes perception, which influences future pricing decisions. They created a feedback mechanism disguised as an assessment tool. The wine market documents from this period reveal the committee's confidence in their methodology. Commercial correspondence shows merchants discussing the classification as a permanent solution to market organization problems. Estate owners accepted their rankings as scientific validation of quality differences that already existed. Buyers embraced the system as reliable guidance for purchase decisions. No participant understood that the classification would function as a market concentration mechanism rather than a competitive organization framework. The classification's embedded assumptions became operational doctrine throughout Bordeaux's commercial infrastructure. Merchants structured their allocation systems according to classified rankings. Buyers developed purchasing strategies based on tiered quality expectations. Estate owners aligned production and pricing decisions with their assigned positions. The entire market system began operating according to the classification's internal logic, creating self-reinforcing cycles that validated the system's initial premises while gradually concentrating market power within the highest-ranked estates. The false assumption that would prove most consequential was the belief that static institutional frameworks could govern dynamic market systems without altering competitive relationships. The committee assumed they were documenting fixed quality relationships that would remain stable over time. They could not anticipate that their classification system would interact with external market forces, new buyer demographics, global demand shifts, supply constraints to produce outcomes that contradicted the system's intended function. The classification was designed to organize existing competition, not to create mechanisms for competitive elimination. By establishing the 1855 classification as permanent institutional doctrine, Bordeaux embedded market concentration potential directly into its commercial foundation. The system that was intended to provide clarity and fairness instead created structural advantages that would compound over time, eventually transforming a diverse agricultural region into a luxury hierarchy centered on artificial scarcity and institutional prestige. 1855 classification required implementation infrastructure to transform institutional rankings into market reality. This implementation occurred through Bordeaux's established négociant system, a network of merchant houses that controlled wine distribution from estates to consumers. The négociant infrastructure appeared to provide neutral market facilitation, connecting producers with buyers through established commercial relationships and standardized trading practices. However, this distribution system contained latent structural biases that would systematically amplify the classification's concentration effects beyond what its designers anticipated or intended. The négociant system operated through exclusive allocation relationships between merchant houses and classified estates. First-growth chateaux typically maintained arrangements with a small number of premium négociants who specialized in luxury wine distribution. These merchant houses developed sophisticated buyer networks among collectors, restaurants, and wine merchants who specifically sought the highest classified wines. The négociant infrastructure thus created parallel distribution channels where different classification tiers accessed fundamentally different market segments, with limited crossover between luxury and standard wine buyers. Within this system, merchant incentive structures naturally favored concentration over diversification. Négociants earned higher profit margins on first growth allocations compared to lower classified wines due to both absolute pricing differentials and reduced sales effort requirements. Premium wines sold themselves based on classification status, while lower-tiered wines required active marketing, education, and price justification to achieve sales. Rational négociants therefore prioritized relationships with top-classified estates and allocated proportionally more sales resources toward promoting wines that generated superior returns with minimal effort. The merchant houses developed buyer conditioning mechanisms that reinforced classification hierarchies. Through systematic expectation management, négociants educated their customers about the significance of classification rankings, emphasizing the rigorous historical analysis that established estate positions and the permanent nature of quality differentials that justified price premiums. Sales personnel received training to present the classification as scientific validation of objective quality differences, not as institutional market organization. Buyers learned to interpret classification status as quality assurance rather than market positioning. This buyer education process created information asymmetries that favored classified estates beyond their intrinsic quality advantages. Most wine consumers possessed limited technical knowledge about viticulture, winemaking processes, or vintage evaluation. They relied on merchant guidance to navigate complex purchasing decisions involving products they could not adequately assess independently. The négociant system provided this guidance through classification-based recommendations that systematically directed consumer attention toward higher-ranked estates, while treating lower-classified wines as inferior alternatives rather than different market segments. The institutional structure of wine commerce further embedded these biases into standard operating procedures. Négociants organized their inventory systems according to classification tiers, with first growths receiving premium storage conditions, handling protocols, and presentation materials. Sales catalogs arranged wines by classification rank, rather than price point or style characteristics. Customer communications emphasized classification status as the primary quality indicator, with secondary attention given to vintage conditions, winemaking techniques, or terroir characteristics that might favor non-classified producers. The French wine trade documentation from this period reveals how négociants conceptualized their role as market facilitators rather than market shapers. Commercial correspondence shows merchant houses discussing classification rankings as objective quality standards that guided rational business decisions. Allocation strategies focused on maintaining adequate supplies of classified wines to meet customer expectations rather than developing markets for unclassified alternatives. The négociants believed they were responding to consumer preferences rather than creating them through systematic institutional bias. Professional buyer training within the negotiant system reinforced these structural preferences through standardized evaluation methodologies. Wine merchants learned assessment techniques that prioritized classification status and vintage reputation over independent quality evaluation. Buyers developed purchasing frameworks based on classification hierarchies that assumed higher-ranked wines provided superior value propositions within their respective price categories. The educational infrastructure created market participants who genuinely believed that classification rankings represented scientific quality measurement rather than competitive market positioning. The allocation system itself created artificial scarcity mechanisms that amplified classification advantages beyond production constraints. First growth estates produced limited quantities due to vineyard size limitations, but negotiants managed these allocations to maximize their strategic value rather than optimize market distribution. Premium wines were rationed to preferred customers who demonstrated loyalty through consistent purchasing patterns and willingness to accept allocation terms. This rationing system created exclusivity effects that reinforced the perception of superior desirability independent of actual quality characteristics. International expansion of the negotiant system exported these structural biases to global wine markets without adapting the institutional framework to different consumer contexts. As Bordeaux wine distribution expanded beyond France, negotiants maintained classification-based marketing approaches that educated new market participants according to the same hierarchical principles. Foreign buyers learned to interpret classification rankings using the same frameworks that had developed within French wine commerce, creating global demand patterns that reflected institutional biases rather than independent quality assessment. The accumulation of these structural factors created systematic advantages for classified estates that operated independently of their winemaking capabilities or terroir characteristics. The negotiant system had evolved into a market concentration mechanism that amplified minor quality differences into major competitive advantages through institutional infrastructure rather than product superiority. The distribution system that was intended to provide neutral market access instead created preferential treatment mechanisms that made classification rankings self-fulfilling prophecies rather than quality assessments. By the time market participants recognized these structural biases, the negotiant system had become too integral to Bordeaux commerce to modify without disrupting the entire regional wine economy. The infrastructure that had created artificial concentration advantages had also created economic dependencies that made systemic reform impractical, embedding market distortions into permanent institutional architecture. The Bordeaux classification system maintained stable competitive relationships for nearly 150 years through multiple market cycles, economic disruptions, and changing consumer preferences. The institutional framework proved remarkably resilient to internal variations, vintage quality differences, estate ownership changes, and evolving winemaking techniques, because these factors operated within the system's original calibration parameters. European wine markets provided predictable demand patterns based on established consumption traditions and price sensitivity levels that aligned with the classification's hierarchical structure. However, in 2008, an external market intervention fundamentally altered the system's operating environment in ways that its designers could never have anticipated. The Hong Kong government's elimination of wine import duties in February 2008 represented a technical shock to global wine distribution systems that exceeded the classification framework's adaptive capacity. This policy change reduced the total cost of premium wine imports by approximately 40%, instantly transforming Hong Kong into the dominant Asian wine trading hub and creating unprecedented access to luxury wine markets for buyers throughout the region. The duty elimination was designed as an economic development initiative to establish Hong Kong as a regional financial center, not as wine market intervention, yet it produced immediate disruption to established pricing relationships that had remained stable for decades. Asian wine buyers operated according to fundamentally different consumption patterns and value assessment frameworks compared to traditional European consumers. Where European buyers had developed sophisticated appreciation for diverse chateau characteristics across multiple classification tiers, Asian consumers focused primarily on prestige signaling and gift-giving applications that prioritized brand recognition and status communication over technical wine evaluation. The negociant system's educational infrastructure, which had successfully managed European buyer expectations through nuanced quality discussions, proved inadequate for Asian consumers who demanded clear hierarchy indicators rather than complex terroir explanations. Market intelligence from this period documents the rapid emergence of concentrated demand patterns that overwhelmed existing distribution mechanisms. Lafite Rothschild experienced demand increases of approximately 300% within 18 months of the Hong Kong duty elimination, while other first growth estates saw more modest increases ranging from 50% to 100%. The demand concentration on Lafite specifically reflected Asian consumer preferences for the most recognizable luxury brands, rather than distributed interest across the first growth category as a whole. This selective demand created pricing pressures that exceeded the classification system's ability to maintain proportional relationships between ranked estates. The technical failure occurred because the classification system had been calibrated to manage European demand elasticity within known parameters. Traditional buyers possessed price sensitivity thresholds that created natural demand constraints when wines exceeded acceptable value propositions. Asian buyers demonstrated price insensitivity levels that eliminated these automatic correction mechanisms, allowing demand to continue increasing beyond sustainable market equilibrium points. The system's feedback loops, which had previously maintained stable competitive relationships through price-mediated demand adjustments, ceased functioning when buyers proved willing to pay any price for preferred brands regardless of historical value relationships. Lafite's documented price performance during this period reveals the magnitude of system divergence from established parameters. Between 2008 and 2011, Lafite prices increased by an average of 245% across multiple vintages, while comparable first growth estates experienced increases ranging from 45% to 85%. These pricing differentials represented the largest disruption to inter-first growth relationships since the original 1855 classification, indicating fundamental breakdown of the competitive balance that the system was designed to maintain. The pricing data demonstrates that external demand shocks could overwhelm institutional frameworks that had successfully managed market relationships for over a century. The Asian market's impact on traditional distribution relationships created additional system stress beyond simple demand volume increases. Negociants discovered that their established allocation systems could not accommodate sudden demand surges concentrated on specific estates without creating severe supply shortages that disrupted customer relationships built over generations. Premium wine inventories that had been managed according to predictable European consumption patterns proved inadequate for Asian demand levels that exceeded historical precedents by orders of magnitude rather than incremental percentages. The classification system's inability to adapt to these new market conditions became evident through the breakdown of traditional quality-price relationships that had provided market stability since the 19th century. Lafite began trading at price premiums that exceeded any reasonable quality differential compared to other first-growth wines, indicating that factors beyond intrinsic wine characteristics were driving market behavior. The 34% average premium that Lafite commanded over other first growths, as documented in subsequent market analysis, demonstrated that the classification system had lost its capacity to maintain competitive equilibrium among supposedly equivalent estates. Traditional European wine buyers began experiencing allocation difficulties as negociants redirected inventory toward Asian markets that offered substantially higher profit margins and reduced price sensitivity. This allocation shift created artificial scarcity in European markets that had previously enjoyed reliable access to classified wines, forcing established customers to compete with new Asian buyers who operated according to entirely different value assessment frameworks. The market disruption extended beyond pricing to fundamentally alter access patterns that had remained stable for decades. The speed of these market changes exceeded the institutional capacity for adaptive response within existing regulatory and commercial frameworks. Bordeaux's wine trade organizations had developed adjustment mechanisms for gradual market evolution, but possessed no protocols for managing sudden external demand shocks that threatened to destabilize the entire regional classification system. The institutional infrastructure that had successfully managed market relationships for 150 years proved inadequate for market conditions that exceeded its foundational assumptions about demand patterns and buyer behavior. By 2011, market participants recognized that the classification system was experiencing unprecedented stress that threatened its long-term viability as a competitive organization framework. However, the external demand forces that had triggered this instability continued operating beyond any institutional control mechanisms, making corrective intervention impossible within existing commercial structures. The system had entered a phase of market concentration that contradicted its foundational principles while remaining technically compliant with its operational procedures. The market disruption triggered by Asian demand revealed fundamental physical constraints within chateau-based wine production that had remained invisible during periods of stable European consumption. Unlike manufactured goods that can scale production capacity to meet demand fluctuations, wine production operates under absolute physical limitations that cannot be overcome through increased investment, technological advancement, or operational optimization. These constraints created supply bottlenecks that interacted catastrophically with the classification system's hierarchical structure, producing market concentration effects that exceeded any possibility of correction through normal competitive mechanisms. Château Lafite Rothschild's vineyard encompasses 112 hectares of planted vines, representing a fixed production capacity that has remained essentially unchanged since the 19th century. The estate's average annual production of 20,000 cases represents the maximum sustainable output from this vineyard area under optimal growing conditions. Unlike industrial production systems that can expand capacity through additional facilities or equipment investment, wine production remains constrained by irreplaceable terroir characteristics that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The Lafite vineyard's specific soil composition, drainage patterns, microclimate conditions, and vine age distribution represent unique physical assets that establish absolute production ceilings independent of market demand levels. The temporal structure of wine production creates additional constraints that prevent rapid supply adjustments in response to demand changes. Wine production follows mandatory annual cycles determined by grape growing seasons, harvest timing, and aging requirements that cannot be accelerated without compromising product quality. Each vintage requires minimum aging periods of 18 to 24 months before release, creating inevitable delays between demand signals and supply responses that exceed the timeframes necessary for market correction. When Asian demand for Lafite increased by 300% between 2008 and 2011, the estate could not increase production proportionally because the required vineyard expansion and vine maturation would require 5 to 10 years to produce marketable wine. The mathematical relationship between exponential demand growth and linear production capacity created unsustainable supply deficits that normal market mechanisms could not resolve. Asian market demand demonstrated compound growth rates exceeding 50% annually for premium Bordeaux wines during peak periods, while production capacity remained fixed at historical levels determined by physical vineyard constraints. This created expanding supply gaps that could only be resolved through price increases rather than production expansion, fundamentally altering the market dynamics that the classification system was designed to manage through competitive balance rather than scarcity concentration. Production constraints affected different classification tiers disproportionately based on their vineyard sizes and historical output levels. First growth estates typically maintained smaller vineyard areas focused on premium production, while lower classified chateaux often possessed larger vineyard holdings that could accommodate modest production increases through improved cultivation techniques or marginally productive land activation. This asymmetry meant that supply shortages affected first growth wines more severely than lower-tier classifications, creating artificial scarcity premiums that reinforced hierarchical advantages beyond any quality-based justification. The wine production data from this period demonstrates how physical constraints converted demand concentration into irreversible market positioning advantages. While total Bordeaux wine production remained relatively stable at approximately 5 to 6 million hectolitres annually, demand for specific high-classification wines created localized shortages that could not be resolved through substitution with comparable products from other estates. Unlike commodity markets where supply shortages can be addressed through alternative suppliers offering functionally equivalent products, Wine buyers specifically demanded bottles from particular chateaux based on classification status and brand recognition rather than comparable quality characteristics. Inventory management systems within the global wine trade proved inadequate for managing supply-demand imbalances of this magnitude. Traditional wine distribution operated on allocation models calibrated for predictable European consumption patterns, with modest year-to-year variations. The sudden emergence of Asian demand created inventory shortfalls that exceeded established buffer capacities, forcing distributors to implement rationing systems that prioritize customers according to purchasing history and relationship value rather than market-based allocation mechanisms. The aging infrastructure at classified estates created additional bottlenecks beyond vineyard capacity constraints. Premium wine production requires substantial barrel aging capacity, temperature-controlled storage facilities, and bottling equipment that represent significant capital investments with long amortization periods. Even if estates could theoretically increase grape production through intensive cultivation techniques, the cellaring infrastructure necessary for quality wine production could not be expanded rapidly enough to accommodate sudden demand increases without compromising production standards that justified premium pricing. The supply constraints also revealed temporal arbitrage opportunities that further distorted market relationships. Wine investors began purchasing new vintage releases immediately upon availability, creating speculative inventory accumulation that reduced supplies available for consumption, while increasing apparent demand pressure on future releases. This speculative activity amplified the supply shortage effects by removing wine from the consumption market and storing it for appreciation purposes, creating artificial scarcity that exceeded the actual production constraints imposed by vineyard limitations. The classification system's structure exacerbated these supply constraint effects by concentrating demand among a small number of top-ranked estates, rather than distributing it across diverse producers. If Asian demand had been distributed proportionally across all Bordeaux estates according to their respective production capacities, the supply constraints would have created modest price pressures across the entire region. Instead, demand concentration on specific classified wines created severe shortages for particular estates, while leaving other producers with surplus inventory, preventing market-wide price adjustments that might have restored competitive equilibrium. By 2011, the interaction between exponential Asian demand and fixed production capacity had created supply deficits for premium classified wines that could not be resolved within reasonable timeframes using existing vineyard resources. The physical constraints of terroir-based wine production had converted market demand into permanent scarcity premiums that exceeded any possibility of competitive correction, fundamentally altering the classification system's function from quality organization to scarcity management. The supply chain analysis revealed that these physical constraints would persist indefinitely because expanding production capacity would require decades of vineyard development that could not address immediate market imbalances, while demand patterns showed no indication of returning to historical levels that had maintained competitive equilibrium within the classification system's original design parameters. The market disruption created by Asian demand concentration prompted systematic efforts by wine industry participants to develop corrective mechanisms that would restore competitive balance while maintaining the classification system's organizational benefits. These stabilization attempts focused primarily on creating transparent secondary markets that would provide accurate price discovery, improve liquidity for wine trading, and reduce information asymmetries that had enabled speculative distortions. However, these market-based solutions systematically failed to address the underlying structural problems, while inadvertently institutionalizing the concentration effects they were intended to correct. The London International Vintners Exchange, LIVEX, established in 1999 but gaining prominence during the 2008-2012 market crisis, represented the most sophisticated attempt to create systematic wine trading infrastructure modeled on financial markets principles. LIVEX was designed to provide transparent pricing data, standardized trading procedures, and liquidity mechanisms that would eliminate the opacity and relationship-based allocation systems that characterized traditional negociant commerce. The platform's founders believed that market transparency would naturally correct pricing distortions by enabling informed comparison shopping and competitive bidding that would reward quality over reputation. The LIVEX trading data from this period reveals how transparency mechanisms systematically reinforced, rather than corrected concentration effects within the classification system. The platform standardized listing procedures organized wines according to classification rankings, with first growths receiving prominent placement and detailed market analytics, while lower classified wines occupied subsidiary categories with minimal trading volume. This organizational structure reflected existing market preferences rather than challenging them, creating digital infrastructure that validated classification hierarchies through apparent market-based validation. The platform's price transparency functions produce comprehensive documentation of the growing premium differentials between Lafite and other classified wines, but this transparency failed to create corrective market pressures. Instead of enabling buyers to recognize pricing anomalies and shift purchases toward better value alternatives, the documented price trends reinforced buyer perceptions that Lafite's premium pricing reflected superior market assessment of its intrinsic value. Transparency converted speculative pricing into apparent market validation, making artificial premiums appear to be rational quality assessments. Auction house sales during this period provided additional evidence of how secondary market mechanisms institutionalized rather than corrected market concentration. Major auction houses including Christie's, Sotheby's, and Acker Merrill and Condit documented systematic bidding patterns that concentrated on the highest classified wines, regardless of vintage quality or current market pricing relative to historical norms. Auction results showed Lafite wines achieving sale prices that exceeded retail market rates by 20 to 40%, indicating that competitive bidding environments amplified rather than corrected the concentration effects created by Asian demand. The auction infrastructure itself created additional concentration mechanisms through lot organization marketing approaches that prioritize prestigious wines over comprehensive quality representation. Auction catalogs featured Lafite and other first-growth wines as headline lots with detailed provenance documentation and expert commentary, while lower-classified wines received minimal attention despite potentially superior quality-to-price relationships. This marketing approach educated buyers to interpret auction participation as validation of superior wine selection, rather than opportunity for independent quality assessment. Wine investment funds emerged during this period as institutional attempts to rationalize wine markets through professional portfolio management and diversification strategies. These funds promised to reduce market volatility through systematic purchasing approaches that would distribute investment capital across multiple estates and vintages, rather than concentrating on speculative favorites. However, fund managers discovered that their fiduciary responsibilities required focusing on wines with established liquidity and appreciation potential, which systematically favored the same highly classified wines that were experiencing concentration effects. The investment fund documentation from 2009 to 2012 demonstrates how institutional approaches to wine markets inadvertently reinforced concentration patterns. Fund managers could not justify purchasing wines that lacked established secondary market liquidity, regardless of their potential quality advantages, because portfolio performance was measured according to market valuations rather than intrinsic wine characteristics. This created systematic bias toward wines that already possessed strong secondary market performance, amplifying concentration effects through institutional capital allocation. Financial instruments designed to provide wine market stability, including wine futures contracts and price hedging mechanisms, proved inadequate for managing market volatility created by concentration effects. These instruments functioned effectively for commodity-like wine categories with predictable supply-demand relationships, but failed when applied to classified wines experiencing demand patterns that exceeded any historical precedent. The mathematical models underlying these financial products could not accommodate market behavior that operated beyond established parameters, creating additional instability rather than stabilization. The development of wine rating and scoring systems during this period represented attempts to provide objective quality assessment alternatives to classification-based purchasing decisions. Professional wine critics, including Robert Parker, Jancis Robinson, and others, expanded their analytical coverage to provide detailed vintage-by-vintage quality evaluations that might enable buyers to identify superior value opportunities independent of classification status. However, these scoring systems inadvertently reinforced concentration effects by providing numerical validation for wines that already possessed institutional advantages through classification rankings. The wine rating data from 2008 to 2012 shows systematic scoring biases that favored highly classified wines independent of blind tasting performance or technical quality measures. Critics unconsciously incorporated classification status and market pricing into their evaluation frameworks, producing scores that validated existing hierarchies rather than challenging them through independent quality assessment. This created apparent scientific justification for market concentration that made speculative pricing appear to be expert-validated quality recognition. Regional wine organizations attempted regulatory interventions to manage market speculation and maintain competitive balance among classified estates. These efforts included allocation restrictions, pricing guidelines, and promotional programs designed to support lower classified wines that were experiencing market marginalization. However, these regulatory approaches proved ineffective because they operated within existing commercial frameworks that had already been captured by concentration dynamics, making reform impossible without fundamentally restructuring the entire regional wine economy. By 2012, the accumulation of failed stabilization attempts had created permanent market infrastructure that systematically reinforced concentration effects rather than correcting them. The secondary markets, rating systems, auction houses, and investment vehicles that were intended to provide market efficiency instead created institutional validation for speculative pricing patterns that had originated from external demand shocks. These market-based solutions had successfully institutionalized the concentration dynamics into permanent commercial infrastructure that made competitive correction impossible within existing frameworks. The systematic price premium that Lafite Rothschild maintains over comparable first-growth wines provides quantitative forensic evidence of permanent market structure alteration that contradicts the 1855 classification's intended function. Market analysis data covering the decade from 2009 to 2019 documents a consistent 34% average price differential between Lafite and the mean pricing of Margaux, Latour, Haut-Brion, and Mouton Rothschild across multiple vintages and market conditions. This premium persists independent of vintage quality assessments, critic scores, or production volume variations, indicating that the differential reflects structural market positioning, rather than product characteristics that might justify sustained competitive advantages. The persistence of this price premium across different market cycles demonstrates that the classification system successfully created permanent competitive asymmetry, rather than the temporary quality-based differentiation that its designers intended. During market downturns when wine prices generally declined, Lafite maintained proportional premium relationships with other first growths, rather than converging toward competitive parity that would be expected if the premium reflected temporary market distortions. Similarly, during market recoveries, the premium relationships expanded proportionally rather than stabilizing at levels that would indicate quality-based price justification. The mathematical analysis of this pricing data reveals the classification system's actual operational mechanism, the creation of self-reinforcing market concentration through institutional validation rather than quality assessment through competitive comparison. The 34% premium represents the quantified market impact of institutional framework design that embedded concentration potential into what appeared to be quality organization. This premium differential proves that the system achieved systematic market control disguised as neutral quality evaluation. Wine production and quality data from this same period provides additional forensic evidence that the pricing differentials operate independently of measurable product characteristics. Blind tasting results conducted by multiple professional wine organizations show no consistent quality advantages for Lafite over other first-growth wines that would justify sustained price premiums of this magnitude. Analytical testing of soil composition, viticultural practices, and winemaking techniques reveals differences between first-growth estates, but no systematic superiority that correlates with market pricing patterns. The disconnect between measurable quality indicators and market pricing demonstrates the classification system's function as a market organization mechanism rather than a quality assessment tool. The system successfully created perceived quality differences that became market reality independent of actual product characteristics. This represents institutional framework success according to unstated objectives market hierarchy creation, while failing according to stated objectives quality-based competitive organization. The institutional analysis reveals how the classification system embedded market concentration mechanisms into seemingly neutral administrative procedures. The use of historical price data as quality validation created circular logic that converted market positioning into quality assessment, then used quality assessment to justify market positioning. This methodology guaranteed that existing market leaders would receive institutional validation that reinforced their competitive advantages indefinitely, regardless of actual performance relative to competitors. The global replication of Bordeaux's classification model in other wine regions provides comparative evidence about institutional market-shaping mechanisms. Regions that adopted similar ranking systems experienced comparable concentration effects, with top-ranked producers achieving sustained price premiums that exceeded quality-based justification. Regions that maintained market organization through geographic appellations or producer cooperatives demonstrated more distributed, competitive relationships, indicating that institutional framework design determines market structure outcomes independent of product quality distributions. The Asian market integration process revealed the classification system's vulnerability to external demand shocks that operated beyond its calibration parameters. The system's designers had optimized the framework for European consumption patterns characterized by gradual changes and price-sensitive buyers. Asian consumers introduced demand patterns and price tolerance levels that overwhelmed the system's correction mechanisms, exposing structural concentration potential that had remained dormant under previous market conditions. The systemic analysis identifies transferable principles for understanding how institutional frameworks shape competitive outcomes beyond their apparent functions. Classification systems that use market-based criteria create self-reinforcing concentration mechanisms, regardless of their stated objectives. Ranking methodologies embed the evaluation criteria into permanent institutional doctrine that shapes future market behavior, rather than documenting existing competitive relationships. Static institutional frameworks cannot govern dynamic market systems without creating structural distortions that favor established participants over competitive merit. The regulatory response analysis demonstrates the difficulty of correcting institutional concentration effects once they become embedded into market infrastructure. Reform efforts consistently failed because they operated within existing commercial frameworks that had already been captured by concentration dynamics. Effective correction would require systematic replacement of institutional infrastructure rather than incremental modification of existing procedures. But such comprehensive reform becomes economically and politically impossible once concentration effects create stakeholder dependencies on existing arrangements. The wine industry's secondary market development provides evidence about how corrective mechanisms can institutionalize, rather than resolve structural problems. Market-based solutions to institutional concentration effects tend to create parallel infrastructure that validates existing hierarchies rather than challenging them. Transparency and efficiency improvements can amplify concentration effects by providing apparent market-based justification for outcomes that originated from institutional design flaws rather than competitive merit. The long-term market data reveals that the classification system achieved comprehensive success according to its implicit design logic, while failing comprehensively according to its explicit stated purposes. The system created stable market hierarchy, predictable competitive relationships, and institutional validation for quality differentiation. However, these achievements occurred through concentration mechanisms rather than competitive organization, scarcity creation rather than quality assessment, and market control rather than market facilitation. The forensic reconstruction demonstrates that institutional market organization tools function as market control mechanisms when their design methodologies embed concentration potential into seemingly neutral administrative procedures. The 1855 classification represents a case study in successful institutional engineering that achieved unstated objectives through systematic competitive elimination disguised as quality evaluation, providing a template for understanding how market concentration can be achieved through institutional design rather than competitive superiority. The systemic lessons indicate that market organization frameworks must be evaluated according to their structural effects rather than their stated intentions, with particular attention to feedback mechanisms that create self-reinforcing competitive advantages independent of performance-based justification. The Bordeaux experience provides definitive evidence that price-based institutional ranking systems inevitably produce concentration rather than competition, regardless of their designers' intentions or participants' expectations.